Facebook is not a private company. By Jeremiah Harding, July 24th, 2020. So, for those of you who haven't heard, our page was summarily banned from Facebook with no reason given, no terms of service broken, and nothing unethical done on our part to justify such censorship. Beyond potentially saying things that the government does not like us saying, our account was only used to promote peaceful market activity. As such, when I had the managing editor of this joint on my show to discuss the suspension and the fact that not only was the page banned, but so was he, I briefly went into the fact that Facebook is basically controlled and used by intelligence, and that they might have just not liked what we had to say, which may have been what led to the decision to remove the page. And apparently, a lot of this stuff has not been condensed into the same area. It hadn't even occurred to me that I should do a full-on expose on Facebook specifically, but I brought it up to him and he seemed very enthusiastic about the prospect of a piece concretely linking Facebook to intelligence and intelligence funding. So, this is that. The more I thought about it, the more I remembered every time I had to explain this to somebody, sending them a barrage of links and a lot of getting nowhere because a lot of people don't like to follow the same rabbit trail you have and come to the same conclusions you did. And it's not even a guarantee that they would. So, I think that this is an incredibly valuable time to remind people that without the CIA, Facebook wouldn't exist. At least not in the form that it does now, as expanded and well-funded as it is. So, here's another long-winded conspiracy theory with all the facts backing it, for most people to ignore out of hand because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. It also took me way too long, and the page is probably very underexposed right now because of the suspension, so if you find it useful, feel free to share it. We could use the views. Additionally, while we're talking about the fusion of government interest to corporate corruption, feel free to remember the definition of a corporation as Konkin put it. Quote, "A corporation is a fictitious individual created by the state and endowed with privileges, some privileges besides subsidies and tariffs or special tax rates, limited liability, exemption from regulation, licenses and legal benefits in court disputes." End quote. I think few modern corporations are a better representation of this definition of corporation. The US government has poured a significant amount of money into Facebook, and so have people who directly work to benefit US intelligence interests. It's an incestuous alliance between a mass information gathering platform and a government which thrives on increasing its power by way of information control. If you control information, you control the world, and the US has been zealous about controlling said information since as long as they've been a country. So, without further ado, let's get into this. Yes, I'm serious. There was an Onion parody not too long ago that called Facebook the CIA's greatest invention, but what I want to tell you today is that it's not that far from reality. Whenever I've brought this up with people, they've asked for corroborating evidence, and to be factual, I've had nothing all in one place. I've had to send them a barrage of links, and that normally doesn't go over very well, especially considering the fact that nobody connects the dots like I do that I have found. But what I have found is that from its inception to the current day, Facebook has a long and storied history of both being staffed by and assisting government officials, primarily in intelligence and narrative control purposes. In doing so, Facebook has effectively become an apparatus of both US intelligence and propaganda, likely by design. But because I'm making some pretty bold claims here, I have to be relatively thorough and complex, and a short BuzzFeed-style article will not work for these purposes. So, strap in and get ready for a ride. This one is not a friendly subject. Facebook launched in 2004, on February 4th, 16 years ago. It was based on the framework Mark Zuckerberg had already set up for a site called FaceMash, which was essentially a prototypical version of Hot or Not and all other degrading dating sites. He put in the faces of fellow Harvard students without their consent and was eventually charged with breaching security and violating copyright and individual privacy. These were later dropped. He kept expanding on the idea until he saw a challenge from Harvard to build a better version of a thing they were already building, which was a digital database of all students on campus. The original Facebook was only that, but would morph into something far more sinister. That is, after the Winklevoss twins sued Zuckerberg for ripping off their ideas in order to compete with their service. This craven behavior sneaks into all the other aspects of Facebook at this point, so I feel it worthy to bring up. It was started by a scammer, and it ultimately lies regularly, so I might as well discuss that. Eventually, use of the app expanded to any other Ivy League university who was interested in adopting it. It started with Columbia, Stanford, and Yale, and then went to everyone else. Then it expanded into all universities and colleges in general, and that's when it started getting some powerful allies. A co-founder of Napster, Sean Parker, came in as company president. They moved to Palo Alto, California, where they still are, and got an investment from PayPal founder and regular Bilderberg attendee Peter Thiel of $500,000, about as much as Thiel's supercar then. 200,000 of which immediately went into buying the new domain of Facebook.com. So what about Peter Thiel? Thiel is the founder of Palantir Technologies, a company that specializes in big data analytics and was already headquartered in Palo Alto before Facebook was in 2003. Its products are used by the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. Department of Defense. It's also used in various other government institutions, most notably for counterterrorism and warfare. It's used by Morgan Stanley, Merck KGaA, and Fiat Chrysler Automobiles NV. It's been a multi-billion-dollar business for many years now, specializing in helping the U.S. government collect and analyze data in huge amounts. However, it got its initial funding for mass operation directly from the CIA, through their venture capital firm In-Q-Tel. This didn't happen until 2005, after Thiel's investment in Zuckerberg, but it highlights a link between the projects of one of the initial investors of Facebook. In In-Q-Tel's portfolio, they cite Palantir as, quote, collaborative data exploration for relationship analysis, elaborating that Palantir offers a suite of software applications for integrating, visualizing, and analyzing the world's information. The technology supports many kinds of data, including structured, unstructured, relational, temporal, and geospatial. Palantir's products are built for real analysis with a focus on security, scalability, ease of use, and collaboration. They are broadly deployed in the intelligence, defense, law enforcement, and financial communities. End quote. It gets worse. According to The Intercept, documents published by Edward Snowden during the infamous leaks he helped facilitate and continues to facilitate occasionally, the now commonly known X-Keyscore program would document, quote, nearly everything a typical user does on the internet. They continued. Collected communications not only include emails, chats, and web browsing traffic, but also pictures, documents, voice calls, webcam photos, web searches, advertising analytics traffic, social media traffic, botnet traffic, logged keystrokes, computer network exploitation targeting, intercepted username and password pairs, file uploads to online services, Skype sessions, and more. End quote. After going on to state that Palantir tech started to be used by almost every Five Eyes country, it went on to say that the GCHQ had access to Palantir tech to run exactly alongside X-Keyscore, and the technology was directly used to process the huge amount of data that came through the X-Keyscore interface. That's right, without Peter Thiel, the NSA's spying software would not have had its infrastructure. It was considered better than offerings from both Lockheed Martin and Dedica. That should tell you something about the quality of their product and how refined it was at collecting information. Anyone who knows anything about defense knows that Lockheed Martin and Dedica have been huge in the industry for a very long time. But two pieces of software made by Palantir made analyzing all the data that they had collected on you, yes you, easy. One was called Kite, and one was called simply X-Keyscore Helper. What this tool allowed was the easy use of all the data collected by the NSA by whoever wanted to use it and had access to it. That means that what Peter Thiel did was provide what amounts to an excellent Google for everything that was going on in the world. You see where I'm going with this? This guy had every interest in Facebook becoming a massively successful data collection program so that all of his concurrent projects could see an easier time in the light of day. That's why he gave Zuckerberg money. Because he thought that the more transparent people were with their information, the easier his job as the head of an intelligence software engineering company would be. And they didn't fade from the public either. In fact, July 6th this year, they filed for an IPO, which means that you, yes, you, could have stock in your own enslavement. And while all of this is already bad, I'm only really scratching the surface, because I could write a whole expose on a lot of the bullshit that they've been involved in. But this article isn't about Palantir, it's about Facebook. And Peter Thiel wasn't the only initial investment to Facebook. Enter Jim Breyer and Excel Partners. Excel Partners is yet another venture capital firm whose investments have included Facebook, Slack, Dropbox, Atlassian, Flipkart, Supercell, Spotify, Etsy, Braintree and Venmo, Vox Media, Lynda.com, Qualtrics, DJI, Cloudera, Jet.com, Ethos, GoFundMe, Vectra Networks Incorporated, Fab Hotels, Browser Stack, Vinculum Group, Instana, CleverTap, and Egyptian Instabug. List from Wikipedia. With that portfolio, it's no wonder that this organization has a significant amount of pull in corporate America and global finance in general, but something to note is that everything this venture capital firm touched, technologically speaking, turned into a tool for the intelligence industrial complex. The CIA uses Atlassian for their private servers. Fusion.io was always advertised directly to Intel, giving them cutting-edge access to tech. Forescout has government networks and security in mind when they make their network technology. Arista gets government contracts for infrastructure. You seeing a pattern here? Well, this same company invested $12.7 million in Facebook in 2005, and the head guy behind the joint, Jim Breyer, decided it was a good enough project to throw exactly $1 million at. Twice the investment to Peter Thiel. That's a whopper of an investment for a startup company designed to allow college students to talk to one another, is it not? Almost like there were plans to make it something more. But let's talk about Jim for a moment. The same year this startup capital was given to Facebook, Breyer had just been selected as the chairperson for the National Venture Capital Association, a huge organization of venture capitalists whose goals basically involve increasing corporate profits for those who meet the status quo and making sure the status quo does not change. Chairs of this organization serve one-year terms, meaning he had 1 year to make his mark. During the same period, Gilman Louie was selected for a 4-year spot as one of multiple directors. Louie is the founder of an organization with which you are now familiar, if you weren't already, In-Q-Tel. So, Jim at least knew the guy behind the business practices I discussed earlier. All the shady stuff with Palantir was made possible by his business. Additionally, this guy was on the board of military defense contractor BBN in 2004, along with Louie. If you can't tell, they knew each other, and they share very similar interests in InfoSec technology and the preservation of government power. This informs all decisions that they've made for what they fund and why they chose to fund it. But Jim wasn't the biggest sugar daddy in the beginning of Facebook's career. Meet Greylock Partners. This venture capital firm was started by Bill Elfers, who used to be the number 2 employee at American Research and Development, the world's first venture firm, designed to keep soldiers in business after World War II. Bill laid the groundwork for all venture capital to come and created the model so many firms now use. Since then, he threw money at Continental Cablevision, Teradyne, Prime Computer, Apollo Computer, Mentor Graphics, Tel Labs, Stryker, Ascend Communications, Zircom, Spyglass, Raptor, Red Hat, Avid Technology, Data Domain, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, Millennium Pharmaceuticals, United Healthcare, Genetics Institute, Wise Technology, Constant Contact, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Zipcar. In 1999, he set up shop in Silicon Valley and noted the potential of the area, but still wanted Boston to be the HQ, saying the East Coast needs its own Silicon Valley, and Boston should be it. So why is this specifically relevant? In 1971, a man named Howard Cox left the office of the Secretary of Defense and joined Greylock as one of the 5 original partners. He was responsible for 30 investments and was eventually presented this year with the Lifetime Achievement in Venture Capital Award from the National Venture Capitalist Association. But that's not all this man was involved in, and for the past 20 years he also served with the investment committee of In-Q-Tel. That's right, the other 2 investors were partially empowered by this one. This one was behind at least part of the ability for both other parties to do what they did. So it should be no surprise to anyone that when Greylock threw money at Facebook to the tune of $25 million in venture capital, the round was also accompanied by Teal and Excel and Meritech. By now, it should be obvious that the most prominent investors in Facebook's early years were directly affiliated with both the military and intelligence industrial complexes respectively, and post 9/11, who wouldn't see dollar signs from a massive corporation with huge potential to get people to voluntarily share every piece of their life with the general public? The CIA wouldn't even need to spy on anyone, and the NSA would have an easy time picking up information because people would just put it out there for free. No investigations needed, no warrants, nothing required at all. All they would need to do is look at what people have agreed to say for likes and shares. It's a match made in Warhawk heaven. So what does all this mean for Facebook in concrete terms? Well, it means that from its inception, Facebook was being considered by government intelligence money a valuable asset, and rightly so. But if those were the only ties to the state, this would be a tenuous set of connections at best. Yes, the CIA had a huge amount of involvement in the original Facebook before it allowed everyone in the world to participate. And sure, the people involved in the inception of Facebook later turned out to be significant players in literally everything you use today, but come on. That isn't enough to say that Facebook is directly beholden to the government now, is it? We wouldn't want to be just a bunch of conspiracy theorists, would we? Well, in order to rationally analyze that, let's see what happened since then. It's not a private company. But Facebook is a private company. This is the typical and highly fallacious response given to me when I criticize Facebook or any major corporation, especially those who regularly censor people for wrongthink. Let me start by saying that even if it was a private company, this does not absolve them of any of the responsibility, guilt, or criticism that comes with making decisions. The fact that one runs a private company does not mean that they are immune to judgment, and if people want to criticize the decisions they're making, people are well within their rights to do so. Also, a private business should want as much user feedback as possible to make sure they have the best product they can. So if my criticisms of them are considered wrong, it's probably because they're doing something that would lose them customers if it came to light. This means that any censorship of said criticism amounts to nothing more than cronyism, allowing flaws to persist no matter who they hurt, as long as the feelings of those who run the joint are not negatively affected, and as long as they can keep making money. This is the inherent root of corruption, and it should go without saying that sunlight is a good disinfectant, so those who wish to exist in the darkness are probably infected, wishing their disease to spread in one way or another. Those diseases, when spread, have huge societal ramifications, not the least of which is tainted dialogue between the common person and those who pull the strings behind society, thus creating an inherent power differential that fosters the fertile soil for tyranny, especially when businesses are so closely affiliated with those in government, and when the incestuous relationship between a business born of government money helping that same government make their money back while gaining power from that government in exchange for giving that government more power, allows the state to get away with a long series of things which they would otherwise not be able to do. A good example of this is Academy, which was Blackwater. They received government contracts as private military contractors to do a lot of dirty work that the US would not be legally allowed to do. This meant that a lot of US foreign policy could be shoved down the throat of the world with no approval needed from the people and often without their knowledge. That's why they were so often involved in the abuse of human rights, because they were inherently designed to do things that humans would not consider right. Like in the infamous Nisour Square massacre, where Blackwater employees opened fire on a bunch of civilians, killing 17 of them and injuring 20 more, doing what would be considered a fascist mass shooting in the US, but what most people these days don't even know about, because the never-ending media cycle would have you believe that the government is always your friend and that you should be more afraid of your neighbor. Suffice it to say, plenty of people were upset about this, and there were a lot of protests resultant of it. But that didn't stop the contractors from continuing to exist, largely unscathed. It also didn't stop them from rebranding multiple times, once to XC and now to Academy. Just because you haven't heard of Blackwater in the news recently doesn't mean they're not still active. This is something a lot of people do. They hide behind another name so that they don't have to take accountability for things they've done. It's basically identity laundering. Academy gets to keep doing all the things they did and still engages in relatively controversial acts, and most people aren't paying attention to them anyway, much less anymore. The US government gets away with human rights abuse under the cover of a corporation or other non-state entity, and people who criticize these non-state entities are met with resistance because they're a private company. But the morally consistent position is to reject all such human rights abuses. This wasn't the only instance of that either from Blackwater, but this article isn't on Academy. I just use them as an example of the kind of evil that can take place when you don't hold corporations at the behest of the state accountable for the actions they do on the state's behalf. For instance, Zero Hedge wrote an article in 2018 called 3 Ways Facebook is Increasingly Becoming an Arm of the US Government. In it, they discuss the fact that Facebook directly affiliates itself with government organizations to do their bidding. Under the cover of corporate separation, Facebook acts as a significant force for state power on a regular basis, and most people have no idea, and don't care when they find out. But Facebook works with 2 government-funded organizations, the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, both funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, a Cold War-era media and information control mechanism. They're also in line with the Atlantic Council, funded by NATO and European governments and Gulf monarchies. These connections were used to wage war during the 2016 elections, that is, control all info in and out of the platform and censor a bunch of people saying things inconvenient to the status quo. Sound familiar? Speaking of familiar, remember Snowden? CIA and NSA guy who proved your online identities were weaponized against you? He spoke on the infamous Cambridge Analytica scandal, tweeting a link to an article that was painting Facebook as the victim of a malicious use of a complex search mechanism to scrape publicly available information about a ton of people in order to assist in campaigns for multiple people. But he wasn't so quick to take the side of the megacorporation because he already knew that social media was a key tool of programs like Xkeyscore and Prism. So his take was as follows, quote, Facebook makes their money by exploiting and selling intimate details about the private lives of millions, far beyond the scant details you voluntarily post. They are not victims, they are accomplices, end quote. Couldn't agree more. In another tweet, he put it exceptionally well by saying, quote, businesses that make money by collecting and selling detailed records of private lives were once plainly described as surveillance companies. Their rebranding as social media is the most successful deception since the Department of War became the Department of Defense. End quote. Nail on the head. He also went on record saying the NSA and Facebook have similar data models. Quote, Facebook's internal purpose, whether they state it publicly or not, is to compile perfect records of private lives to the maximum extent of their capability, and then exploit that to their own corporate enrichment. Damn the consequences. This is actually precisely the same as what the NSA does. End quote. He has a lot more info on them too, like how you should, quote, get rid of Dropbox because they don't protect your files, and He said the same thing with Facebook and Google products. Great resource in general. Point is, Facebook is exactly like US intelligence and runs alongside them in almost every respect. And isn't it funny that the same corporations that were funded by the same people behind Facebook are all part of this giant conglomerate of information stealing and intelligence gathering apparatuses that people who know how bad it is say you should avoid? Well, let's backtrack a little to Cambridge Analytica. This was a company based around using all the publicly available tools that Facebook offered to their fullest potential and aggregating all this data for the purposes of information control, manipulation, and public perception generation. They puppeteered an entire user base, and all they had to do was use the public tools to which the user base was offering free information in order to do it all. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of articles about this in the mainstream press, and everybody seems to agree that it was a bad idea to allow this kind of information control to be possible from the public end. There were movies, TV specials, and more, with the news media video cycle constantly railing about it for a long time, while heavily publicized trials occurred over the legality of things associated with this. But most people didn't stop to ask the question, if this is what the public had access to, what does Facebook itself have access to? And how are they puppeteering everyone to begin with? How much power does Facebook have, and how much power are the common people giving it? And more to the point, how much power do they enable the government to have, which the government would not already have with freer expression and freer principles? All of these questions elicit interesting answers to the critical mind, showing that the common person has sacrificed so much of their informational freedom, they are effectively being made a slave by the social media platforms they're using. There have been many studies done by Facebook to determine whether or not they could switch on circuits in people's minds to get them to believe certain things, or feel a certain way. There have been more that have been conducted on the idea of using Facebook as a mainstreaming application for whatever thoughts a government or corporation might want them to have. And given others which have come to the conclusion that social media is as addictive, if not more addictive than drugs, this level of control is literally habit forming, and the people using it are becoming addicted to their own informational enslavement. So, is a corporation with this many state-adjacent funds directly funded by people who have an interest in information control, aggregation, and manipulation for the purposes of furthering the interests of state actors working directly for those state actors to ensure that nothing outside the status quo is ever said using their platform, at least not for long, thus controlling a significant portion of the information people see, and therefore public opinion itself, given the amount of time its billions of users spend getting information from it, and granted all the special privileges and exemptions that corporate status allows, truly a private business? No. The answer is no. When you've been funded by theft, taxation, to do the will of the state, and when you've never deviated from this course, you are not private, or else all is private, and the distinction between private and public sectors becomes utterly meaningless and bereft of value. Karl Hess put this very well in an edition of the Libertarian Forum by saying, quote, "Take, for example, the state universities. This is property built on funds stolen from the taxpayers. Since the state has not found or put into effect a way of returning ownership of this property to the tax-paying public, the proper owners of this university are the homesteaders, those who have already been using and therefore mixing their labor with the facilities. The prime consideration is to deprive the thief, in this case the state, as quickly as possible of the ownership and control of its ill-gotten gains, to return the property to the innocent private sector. This means student and or faculty ownership of the universities. As between the two groups, these students have a prior claim, for the students have been paying at least some amount to support the university, whereas the faculty suffer from the moral talent of living off state funds, and thereby becoming to some extent a part of the state apparatus. The same principle applies to nominally private property, which really comes from the state as a result of zealous lobbying on behalf of the recipient. Columbia University, for example, which receives nearly 2/3 of its income from the government, is only a private college in the most ironic sense. It deserves a similar fate of virtuous homesteading confiscation. But if Columbia University, what of General Dynamics? What of the myriad of corporations, which are integral parts of the military-industrial complex, which not only get over half or sometimes virtually all their revenue from the government, but also participate in mass murder. What are their credentials to private property? Surely less than zero. As eager lobbyists for these contracts and subsidies, as co-founders of the garrison state, they deserve confiscation and reversion of their property to the genuine private sector as rapidly as possible. To say that their private property must be respected is to say that the property stolen by the horse thief and the murderer must be respected. End quote. And it gets worse. Meet the government to Facebook pipeline. The Free Thought Project wrote an article in February 2019 after Facebook had made the decision not too long before to censor hundreds of pro-freedom pages, including the Free Thought Project, which had garnered 6 million likes, spreading truth, and generally spreading the good word about how information can save people from tyranny. Let me talk about that for a moment, though. Facebook is only big because we allow it to be big. The users that power Facebook are the energy behind it, and without us, they have absolutely nothing. So anytime they ban a page which has gotten them a significant amount of money and traffic, they're effectively saying that we need to work for them for free and hope that we can still do it for the following morning, with no guarantees of such. Given the fact that they are indeed not a private platform, this is effectively the same as government censorship, and with the added bonus of allowing them to gain massive profits, this seems no better than fascism. Only that which benefits the state is allowed, and only so long as they deem it fit. Step out of line and you might lose everything tomorrow, despite being their revenue source. It's an abuse of power, and something that both capitalists who want the government out of their wallets and out of their personal lives, and anti-capitalists who recognize the connection between the state and capital and recognize the amount of power that puts in the hands of the very few, can agree is not a good thing. This is the primary reason they want pages like the Free Thought Project off their site, because when sites like this show such regular proof of systemic corruption and deep problems that reach all the way back to the inception of the country, they threaten this stranglehold of information, because people will start to look past the fact that something has governmental approval as their primary reason for accepting it as true. So it's no wonder that TFTP was eventually kicked off the site. It's also evidence that the site is run by corrupt statists for the purpose of the state. Just thought I'd point that out to really hammer the point home that Facebook is far from private. Anyway, in their article, they went over how people like Nathaniel Gleicher are running FB's censorship after, quote, he prosecuted cybercrime at the U.S. Department of Justice and served as Director for Cybersecurity Policy at the National Security Council, end quote. I want their site to get the credit they deserve, so I'll list the other names of the government officials then working at FB, and if you want to find their connections, you can go check the article out. The names read like a Bible passage about who begat whom, because there are so many of them it seems like a bloodline. Only this time it's not by birth, but by virtue of being in bed with the state. Joel Benenson, Anish Rahman, Sarah Feinberg, David Recordon, Meredith Cardin, David Plouffe, Josh W. Higgins, Lauren Aubachi, Danielle Sverko Gadicki, Sarah Pollock, Ben Fodor, Bonnie Calvin, Julianne Sun, Jamie Fly, Joel David Kaplan, and Myria Jordan. And at this point, likely more, because they recently did yet another purge to get rid of anyone even remotely connected to Boogaloo. As you can see, I'm not remotely wrong in my conclusion that Facebook is not a private company, because a company staffed by the state to serve the state's purposes after getting its initial funding from statist and state money is not private. It's especially not private when it acts like the informational Gestapo, getting in the way of the common person by trying to censor information that might help them realize how corrupt the system actually is, were they to see it. Facebook is the largest social media company in America, and they act in theory and practice not only as the single greatest piece of technology for spies in the intelligence industrial complex at large, but they also act as a propaganda arm for the U.S. government and allies, providing every one of the 5, 9, and 14 eyes of global intelligence, and all of the allies under the hegemony they created, all of the informational control and asymmetrical power they would ever need over the common person, in order to ensure the grip of the status quo doesn't even loosen and can grow perpetually tighter in response to any perceived rebellion. In 2011, people were already starting to take notice of this fact, and even CBS News was telling people that Facebook is a tool of the CIA, but nobody believes people like me when we say it because we're crazy conspiracy theorists. But in that same article, the author went on to say that Facebook, even at that time, was the world's largest database, and it's grown even larger since, ballooning in size and magnitude and maintaining its informational grip. The piece reported that even then Facebook had already gotten in bed with the CIA and the world's largest ad agency network, WPPGY, and In-Q-Tel-funded Visible Technologies, to use ads and user tracking data to build profiles on every single person who uses the site. That's right, those cookies you accept for ads as a condition of being on certain websites might be a part of a CIA-affiliated ad tracking agency using those cookies to watch your browsing across the internet, building a sinister information profile in synergistic connection with your social media activity, concretely connecting you, your data, and everything you know to your internet browsing history. Additionally, Cloudera, a CIA-backed data infrastructure company, is behind their data storage solutions. Seriously. This, combined with the fact that the intelligence agencies in the US use a system of hops, degrees of separation, usually 3 is enough, in order to determine how close somebody is to a potential target so that they can determine whether or not action should be taken, means that there's a distinct possibility that if someone you know knows somebody who Googled something that the state would get suspicious of, you could be in their informational web of targets. And all because you use services like Facebook, which have no problem mining your data for the purposes of essentially controlling society. So, how does this look? And what can it do? Not too long ago, I wrote a series of articles for this place on the scams that surround the coronavirus and the fact that basically this is being used as a way to allow for the expansion and cementing of an artificial intelligence-based facial recognition superstate. I wrote that article based on a series of information I have about 2 blockchains that are attempting to be built for the US government. One for ID, which could be used globally and would permanently attach your record to the blockchain, and one which could be used for the digital dollar, and the implementation of a privacy-free lifestyle completely controlled and monitored by the US government. I also wrote about how the US government is encouraging facial recognition everywhere as a way to go contact-free over this virus. I mentioned the fact that facial recognition is working with large databases of information to immediately be able to identify, monitor, and control anyone they wanted to. I also mentioned the fact that these people in big data intelligence have directly worked with law enforcement in order to weaponize social media against the common person, and use it to track and control what they do by querying the database of social media profiles for their face based on nothing more than a snapshot, and how the technology responsible, Clearview, has technology in its code designed to be implemented in smart cameras, specifically the smart cameras in smart glasses and cameras, so that Chinese-style superstatism can come to the US. That's where a company like Facebook comes in. They gave you the option to build a huge database of information, including pictures of your face, your family and friends, your acquaintances, your enemies, your favorite foods. When Anarchitects made a video on this before Facebook was even a year old, they put the breathtaking amount of information in easy terms, listing, quote, favorite music, books, movies, their address, hometown, phone number, email, clubs, jobs, educational history, birth dates, sexual orientation, interests, daily schedules, exactly how they are related to friends, pictures of themselves, and even political affiliations. They continued, its privacy policy even goes so far as to state it also collects information about you from other sources, such as newspapers and instant messaging services. This information is gathered regardless of your use of the website. Think that's scary? Facebook's terms of service state by posting member content to any part of the website, you automatically grant and represent and warrant that you have the right to grant Facebook an irrevocable, actual, non-exclusive, transferable, fully paid worldwide license with the right to sublicense to use, copy, perform, display, reformat, translate excerpts in whole or in part and distribute such information and content, and to prepare derivative works of or incorporate into other works such information and content, and to grant authorized sublicenses of the foregoing." End quote. That vid also described the close relation to the Information Awareness Office, a Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency program shuttered in 2003 after it was proven to be a tool for mass surveillance. Snowden proved IAO projects are still alive, though, just under different names. Sort of like how Blackwater became XC and then Academy. The vid states that the IAO was interested in, quote, gathering as much information as possible about everyone in a centralized location for easy perusal by the U.S. government, including, but not limited to, internet activity, credit card purchase history, airline ticket purchases, car rentals, medical records, educational transcripts, driver's licenses, utility bills, tax returns, and any other available data. End quote. Sound familiar? Maybe a clear view or something. Enough information that they seriously pondered whether or not adults should be able to solicit nudes from children. Yikes. That's right. Facebook has become the single greatest weapon against the American people the U.S. government has access to, directly funded, supported, and in support of the U.S. government. They have your information, and they have no problems using it against you. They have no problem destroying all your work if your information so happens to be the kind of information that would damage their interests. It's an apparatus of social control, funded entirely for the purpose of that control, and anyone who says that it's anything else has no idea the amount of work that went into getting them to believe that. Or, they're liars, running cover for these usurpers. They spent billions of dollars to stealthily build a platform whereby people created a dossier on themselves voluntarily, with no idea the amount of information they were giving directly to the U.S. government, or what information would eventually be used for, which ultimately amounts to a massive infrastructure of social control and informational asymmetricality. They pwned you. All your base are belong to them, and worse yet, many people are now capitulating to their demands to present a government ID in order to continue using Facebook services, meaning that Facebook has effectively built a database to which they can directly tie your actions in case the government ever decides that you're a threat and thinks they need to do something about it. So where does that leave us? I suck at brevity. And it's always been a problem of mine that I can't be concise because I think that subjects are way too complex to devote a tiny amount of time to. And this has resulted in many things taking way longer than they should have or way longer than necessary. I don't think this is an example of one of those times. I needed to cover the breadth of Facebook collusion and delve deeply enough into this subject that it could be totally explained with no room for consideration. Because of that, an article which was originally going to be both about Facebook being non-private and also a list of alternatives that the common person could eventually use, turned into an article strictly about how Facebook is an arm of the intelligence industrial complex and a propaganda wing of the United States government. I had to go over the fact that many of the venture capitalists behind most of the rest of the things people use now were very interested in broadening intelligence capabilities around the same time as Facebook was being built. Post 9/11, people had to get used to their privacies being ever more threatened with things like the Patriot Act and more, but you couldn't just take it all at once. You needed to take it incrementally, so that the common person had no idea it had been done to them. Because of this, my article needed to be split into two, so keep an eye on this site for part 2 to this series, empowering you to get on networks that are less controlled opposition and more simply a place for you to express yourself and network. But, suffice it to say, don't expect me to be on Facebook for much longer because they have to lie in order to kick people off. Brandon Agro, the guy behind this site, was fraudulently removed from the platform even though he violated no terms of service, simply because he was affiliated with a bunch of pro-freedom pages who made it clear that "don't tread on me" means something. Well, a corporation like Facebook, purpose-built to tread on people and funded and staffed by professional treaders, would obviously take issue with that, and take issue they did. They removed Brandon, and with him a lot of Facebook pages, not the least of which was a page devoted to libertarianism with a couple 100,000 likes, and the official Agorist Nexus Facebook page. So I figured, hey, if Zuckerberg wants to go to war, we can do that, but ultimately war on his turf might lead to my censorship as well. Find me elsewhere, even though precisely nothing in this article nor my sharing of it will violate terms of service. They don't care. They're not paid to care. They're paid to control you. The question you have to ask yourself, are you okay with that? And more to the point, what are you going to do about it?